What I really like about sneakers is that while its primary function is to protect your feet, it is also an outlet to express yourself, whether you just like to mock up some old Converses with a pen or go full on customizing them with some paint and a brush. It doesn't really matter, because to those people who see sneakers as more than just shoes, to us, who see the finer details in our footwear, creative freedom in the form of a great sneaker is something beautiful to look at. And today, we're going to look deeper into a shoe that might be one of the most daring sneakers in newer time. And that sneaker is the Nike Air Max Sean Wotherspoon. As always on Shoe Philosophy, before we can look at the shoe, we first need to understand the person behind it, and that's Sean Wotherspoon himself. Sean was born in 1990 in Richmond, Virginia, and was from a young age a connoisseur of vintage clothing from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. As regular stores moved away from vintage clothing and adopted a more modern style, Sean would spend his time at different thrift shops to look for those special vintage pieces now that ordinary retailers weren't offering them anymore. And it was during this time that he got the idea for what would later become his own clothing empire. While there were plenty of stores offering vintage clothing for women, Sean realized that there weren't enough stores offering vintage clothing for men in his town, and therefore he decided to open his own store, which he called Round 2. Even when Round 2 first opened, Sean and a couple of his friends who he owned the store with said that even from day one things were flying off the shelves, and him and his friends would soon need to open up the opportunity for people to come in and sell them their own clothes, because Sean and his friends just couldn't fill up their inventory otherwise. Sean also got the clever idea to use social media to his advantage. One of the things that he contributes to the success of Round 2 was their choice of starting a YouTube channel that would host a show called The Show by Round 2, where people would enter this Round 2 store, and then Sean and his friends would value the items that they brought in and give them a price on what they thought it was worth. It's kind of a vintage version of Pawn Stars, and it was this marketing ploy that would spread the Round 2 name all over the US and eventually spark the interest to open a store in the capital of vintage clothing, which is Los Angeles. Another big factor that he contributes to the success of his store was the birth of Instagram. Sean has stated that he might have been one of the first people to actually use Instagram as a platform to sell his clothes. He states that in the beginning it was more of a way to catalog his finds and maybe get some likes, but soon out it turned into an opportunity to sell his things online without the need of a website. And while this kind of method seems obvious today, back then nobody was doing it. And Sean was one of the first people to actually revolutionize this method of marketing. So through some clever marketing on Instagram and YouTube, Sean now owns around 7 stores in the US, in New York, Los Angeles, South Beach, and Virginia. And his business are making him millions of dollars each year. And while this is all impressive and interesting in his own right, he also got the opportunity to create possibly one of the most interesting sneakers of the decade. As many of you know, Nike has a tradition of celebrating Air Max Day. Some might just call this wonderful day one big ad, and while there is some truth to that, I still like to believe that it is a day most sneakerheads look forward to. It was during the 2017 Air Max Day that Nike had an idea to spice up their event. Nike decided to invite what they called revolutionaires, which were people known in the sneaker community, and letting them design their own Air Max sneaker that people would then get a week to vote on, and the sneaker who won the vote would then get to see the light of day in the form of a limited release. Out of those who were picked, Sean was one of them, and as we all know, he would also be the one who eventually went on to win the contest, and that's when we got to see his idea come to life. As I mentioned before, we laid down that Sean is no designer per se. He is a successful businessman, but just because you don't design as a profession doesn't mean that you can't create something that looks great. As I mentioned in my former video about the Golf of Fleurs, Tyler himself wasn't a professional designer either, but he didn't need to be. He just let his personality shine through in his design, and I like to think that Sean did the same thing with the Wotherspoons. If I had to point out what Sean's design philosophy is, it would be vintage heavy. Sean isn't a guy who tries to create something provocative or something that tries to have a hidden meaning. His way of doing things, whether it be business or his shoes, is because he thinks it is cool or a good idea. Vintage clothing and vintage itself is a cool phenomenon because you just don't get to see this kind of style of expression done today. Most of the newer styles of today has a big focus on minimalism and neutral colors, and it is therefore understandable that some people long after the individualistic and personal way of expression that the clothes from the former decades provided. But how does this approach of Sean's vintage heavy focus come together in the Air Max Wotherspoons? The Air Max Wotherspoons is in my opinion a great example of what you can create with the remnants from the past decades, coming with an Air Max 97 upper, an Air Max 1 sole, and an Air Max 90 air unit alongside different layers of colors, all in full-on corduroy. When talking about why Sean went with this color scheme for the Sean Wotherspoons, he said that he was inspired by the colorful windbreakers of the 80s and 90s, and that he also wanted the shoe to go well with a white t-shirt because that's what he mostly wears. It's definitely one of those sneakers that get people talking. When looking at the colors that are used, you instantly get that vintage vibe. Mixing the different pastel colors and different layers that gets louder the higher you look, and finishing it off with a full-on corduroy approach really makes this shoe stand out from what Nike usually releases, and definitely makes it stand out from the Air Max 270 that also released that same year. The smaller details that Sean also decided to go with really adds to the shoe, like the little extra swoosh and the smiley face on the insole that was taken from an old Nike t-shirt that said "Have a Nike Day," the switchable patches that comes with the shoe that you can put on a jacket, and the VA to LA embroidery on the heel that details Sean's own move from Virginia to Los Angeles. It's details like these that really makes this shoe extra special, and why I think this shoe perfectly captures Sean's personality, because in some ways this shoe is Sean Wotherspoon, more than just a name. And the choice of corduroy is also really interesting because I don't think we've seen it on a sneaker before. Corduroy is also a fabric that was initially used in the beginning of the 1900s and later resurfaced in the 70s, so the material alone gives this shoe that vintage feel that I think Sean wanted it to have. Another fact about the corduroy found in the Wotherspoons is that, unlike with synthetic leather shoes that will crease with use, the Sean Wotherspoon's corduroy upper will eventually begin to fray the more you use it, and with time it will actually get a really raw look, which I personally think adds to the personality of the shoe, which is nice, but from I can tell from resellers and also hypebeasts, they aren't so happy with this detail because they think it actually ruins the shoe. I think generally the Wotherspoons is more than just a shoe that bears Sean's name, and I think that the man himself would also agree. The shoe itself exudes personality, and you can feel the vintage heritage from this shoe by just looking at it, and I believe that it really catches who Sean Wotherspoon really is, a man who loves his classic styles of old, and it's amazing to see his own vision being incorporated into a shoe that takes so many great parts from Nike's available catalog. And I'm also happy that this was the shoe that won the competition, because honestly, when looking at Sean's competitors, well, let's just say I'm really happy that this was the shoe that actually went into production. And as a final note, I would like to take a moment to talk about what I personally think of the Sean Wotherspoons. And I personally believe that this was one of Nike's best releases in 2018, and to think that it didn't even come from them. The Sean Wotherspoons is one of those shoes that you know will eventually become a classic, not because of the price or the hype surrounding it, but because it is a very special shoe. It's a unique shoe that you only get to see every so often, and I'm really sad that the plans to release more variations of the Wotherspoons isn't going to happen, but hey, I mean, at least we get to see more shoes from Sean getting released in the near future, and hopefully this time I get to cop a pair. I would like to end this segment with a quote from the man himself that I found to really catch the essence of what makes this shoe special. Quote, "When we designed these shoes, I tried to take my nostalgic memories and create something new from them. That's my thing. It's an organic feeling, and as you can see in the shoes we made, it's pretty special." That's all I have for you guys. I hope you liked the video, and feel free to tell me what you think about the Wotherspoons down in the comment section below. I'm SneakerKlev, and I'll see you in the next video.